Hello and welcome to my music room in sunny Los Angeles. Today I thought I would tackle a sort of pretty fundamental issue for anyone who's getting into collecting classical music. You read and hear a lot about different pressings, reissue companies, etc. And it's a whole complicated thing. But really what it goes back to is the history of how music is recorded. And this gets into really the fundamental question that I'm asking, which is why do some records sound better than others? Often the same recording itself, but in different issues it sounds better than others. Why is that? So I thought I would just give a sort of brief overview of the history of recording, and which will answer, I hope, to some degree, this question. Okay, so when you talk about classical recordings, let's go back to the beginning. And the earliest recordings were done very primitively. They're done acoustically, done electrically, in a very simple way. The earliest recordings, which exist on 78s, the early electrical recordings, for example, you basically would have a microphone leading to the platter on which you were, or the cylinder or whatever, you were recording the sound waves. This is before tape is invented. Now, many of these older recordings have tremendous value because they are recordings of great performers, sometimes the composers themselves playing or conducting. But the sound on these it can be a bit ropey. Now, in earlier days of records, once we get into LPs versus 78s, these recordings would be reissued. At one point in time, they would do this rather dubious process of electronically reprocessing the mono signal to a kind of a fake stereo. And in general, if you see that on a record where it says electronically reprocessed for stereo, you want to avoid it. But nowadays, especially with the advent of the CD and digital, and all the new technology that digital has, people can go into these old recordings and make them sound really great. They can get rid of a lot of the surface noise, the ticks, the pops, all the stuff that kind of gets between you and the recording, and they can make them sound really good. Now, there is a big philosophical debate in this area amongst collectors and people who do these reissues. There is one side of the argument which says you do as little intervention as possible. You keep it mono, you keep the sound basically intrinsically true to how the original recording was. Now there's another side of the argument which says, no, let's use these tools to make this sound as good as possible. And never twain shall meet. But the result is that some of these people who are doing these remasterings of these old, and like I say, these are pre-LP recordings or very early LP recordings, some of these remasterings are incredible. And I'm going to mention in particular this label called Pristine Classical. This is out of England. It's the label run by someone called Andrew Rose. He was a BBC technician, sound engineer, and he has developed this whole way, a new version, as it were, of doing the reprocessed for stereo. He calls it XR mastering. And all I can say is it's phenomenal. These recordings sound better than they've ever sounded before, and I'm afraid it rather puts into shade the attempts to do this remastering in a less interventionist way. I think for people to explore and discover these recordings, you want to make them sound as good as possible. And he has a website, Pristine Classical, and you can order from him either CD versions or downloads in different levels of fidelity. This is what one of the CDs might look like. This is an incredible cycle of Beethoven symphonies conducted by the great Arturo Toscanini. And this is the 1939 cycle. Most people know his recording, the later recording done by RCA in New York in the 50s, I think it was. Very dry acoustic. These performances are better, and this remastering is unbelievable. This cycle is actually now one of my favorite Beethoven cycles, irrespective of sound. The sound is so vivid in this XR remastering that you need to make very few allowances, if any, for it. And my goodness, it's Toscanini. It's fantastic. So Pristine Classical, if you're interested in exploring early classical recordings, and it's a huge world to enter into, but it's magical. I can't recommend it highly enough. I'm going to mention another very interesting issue of early classical recordings, and this is Elgar Remastered. This is a several disc set, the great Edwardian composer Elgar, and he was a great conductor of his own music. And what's fascinating about this set, this is not Pristine Classical, this is done by another engineer called Lani Spa. Some of these, even though the recordings are ancient, they're in stereo and they're in hangs a tale. Basically, these early electrical recordings, they had their main microphone set up, and then they had a backup. But of necessity, that microphone was in a slightly different place in the room. So it's not picking up exactly the same information as the main recording. And when Lani Spa was putting together this set of Elgar recordings, it's a long, complicated story, but basically he discovered these extra discs. So by digitally combining the two sources, one from a microphone, say, on this side, and another microphone here, he was able to create stereo. So some of these recordings are, in fact, in accidental stereo. They sound amazing. And it's very interesting. On a couple of them, it cuts out from stereo to the regular mono because he didn't have the extra discs. And you can really hear the difference. That's not to say that mono can't sound really good. It really can sound really good. But go figure. This is a wonderful set. I can't recommend it highly enough. And it's a little different to the Pristine. It's not so full in sound, but it's still, you're basically getting an early form of stereo. Can't recommend it highly enough. So let's talk about, as we move from the early era of 78s into LPs, and first of all, you have a whole period of time where things are recorded in mono. But what we're going to focus on is as we move into stereo. And this is where we get into the sort of beginning of why some records sound better than others. Now, for the moment, we're just going to talk about analog. This is recordings made to tape, often using a more old-fashioned kind of microphone, a ribbon microphone. It's a very purist kind of approach, and often in the amplifiers that are recording the signal, you've got tubes. This is before solid state and transistors are widely used. This is why this is part of the reason why many people believe the early stereo recordings done by labels like RCA Living Stereo, Mercury, Decca, EMI sound better than the later records. It's to do with this signal path, the fact that it's going to tape, and the fact that the engineers at that time used a very minimal microphone setup. The most famous example would be the famous Decca tree, which was essentially a stand with 3 microphones, and that stand was placed more or less where the conductor is. So what the microphones picked up was what the conductor was hearing and how he had balanced the orchestra for that. So many of these really great recordings from the dawn of stereo, from the late 50s through to the early 60s, are recorded in this very minimalist kind of way. There were also experiments with recording to 35mm film, and as the years went by, they also started to use 1 or 2 extra microphones in amongst the orchestra just to pick up a little bit extra information. But these are the records, the original pressings on Decca, on RCA, on EMI, Columbia, it was often known back then. These are why these are so highly treasured, because it was a minimalist recording approach. And then when the records were made, they were mastered using tubes in the signal path. So it's a very organic kind of sound. Now, to you, the collector, what does this mean? Okay, well, if we're going to talk about getting original pressings or versus reissues, let me show you an example of the differences in what you're going to actually see in the shop or online. This is a wonderful record by Benjamin Britten, the English composer, recording English music for strings in St. Maltings, which is the concert hall near Aldeburgh. Fantastic acoustic. Basically wood floor, wood walls, suspended wooden floor, beautifully resonant space. This is a stunning record, recorded by the great Kenneth Wilkinson, who was one of the top Decca engineers. Now, here is the original first pressing. Came out in 1969, and the record inside, this is what it looks like. It's called the Decca wideband. Now, as you can see, it's a wideband here, and the lettering is in this style. Now, the whole issue of what first, second, third pressings look like is a whole separate issue. I'm not going to go into that right now, but different pressings are mastered differently. But if you wanted to go for a first pressing of this album, this is the one. This is what it will look like. And if you go to Discogs, the first one that comes up, UK pressing, Decca, wideband, this is what it looks like. Now, 69 was right at the point at which it was changing from mastering using tubes in the signal path to using transistors. And the sound changed. Now, here's another copy of the same record. It essentially looks exactly the same front and back, but if you open up the record, take it out, you'll see it's a different label, a narrow band here, Decca's in a box like this. Now, this came out exactly the same year, 1969, and this was actually my first copy that I got. But it sounds different because it's mastered with transistors. There isn't quite the same richness, organic fullness to the string sound and to the whole sound. It's very clear in one particular piece, in the Britten Simple Symphony. The second movement, I think it is called the Playful Pizzicato, and my God, the way those pizzicatos resonate, and you can hear the way the strings are meeting the finger, and the strings are hitting the fingerboard as they pluck the strings. I mean, you can really hear the difference between this pressing and the first pressing. Now, let's look at a reissue. One of the top reissue companies, one of the early reissue companies, was this one, King Super Analog out of Japan, although some of them were also done here in America. A kind of a precursor, the company that was working with was the precursor to Impex, which is one of the top reissue labels now. King Super Analog did concentrate on the Decca and London catalogs. London was the American version of the Decca catalog. That's a whole other topic of conversation. I will later be doing breakdowns of all these labels and the differences, etc., etc. What King Super Analog did, which was a little bit different, is they actually got the original multi-track tapes and did a little bit of judicious remixing, more evident on some recordings than others. And they used, to my knowledge, they definitely used an all analog signal path, but also tubes. So this record actually comes closest in sound in some ways to the original first Decca pressing. It's a slightly darker sound, but you also have the advantage, this is heavyweight vinyl. It's just a better quality overall. Although having said that, and I own many original pressings of Deccas and EMIs, Columbias, etc. Nowadays, if you've got a really good record cleaning machine, it's amazing how much of all the background stuff you can get rid of. But overall, yes, I would guess it's a slightly quieter pressing. So there you have an example of one record and how it sounds different in different iterations. I don't know if this is available. I know it's available in a London pressing, whether it's a UK or a US version, I'm not sure. The London pressings of Decca records, it's safe to buy them if it says made in England, made in UK on the record itself. If it doesn't say that, or if it says made in US, avoid it like the plague. They, in general, well, with a few exceptions, don't sound nearly as good. So basically, the whole thing with classical records and what audiophiles who are into classical, what they're looking for is the best quality of sound. The thing which gets closest to how the original master tape and first pressing sound. So that's why they're often willing to pay the big bucks for a first pressing. But to be honest, you know, later UK pressings using transistors of Decca EMI can sound really great. There isn't that much difference. There's also a sort of slightly fetishistic aspect to this whole thing. Like the collectors, they feel they have to have the first pressing. Now, I will say I've got a few first pressings which do not sound as good as reissues. A very good example is I have a first pressing of España, a very famous audiophile record. It's been reissued by Speaker's Corner. I have a first pressing and it doesn't sound that great. This is a complicated realm, but this is really what people who really get into classical, these are the kind of things they're thinking about. Now, the good news is that, especially now, we have reissue labels which are doing a tremendous job. And I'm just going to talk about some of reissue labels over the years and what they did and why they sound good or don't sound so good, whatever. One of the first reissue labels to tackle the RCA Living Stereo catalog, so the RCA Living Stereo, which are from basically the mid-50s to the early 60s. They're amongst the best sounding, most prized classical records out there. One of the first companies to delve into this catalog was Chesky Records, but they didn't license the original artwork, so they all had their own artwork. Now, these Chesky pressings at the time were real audiophile pressings, but they're not as good as what came afterwards on classic records, analog productions, etc. However, there are a few titles on Chesky which have never been reissued by anyone else. And here is an absolute prime one. This is Brahms's Fourth Symphony, played by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Fritz Reiner. Now, Fritz Reiner made a whole series of the greatest, most fabulous living stereos with his own orchestra, the Chicago Symphony. But he did this one-off with the RPO, the Royal Philharmonic, in London, engineered by Kenneth Wilkinson. And this is a tremendous performance and a tremendous recording. It's one of the best of Brahms 4 I can think of. And you can find this used for not too much money. So Chesky, yeah, I mean, they did Pines of Rome and the other great Fritz Reiner records. And for those you want to look elsewhere, but here's one that's only available on Chesky. Another company that got into the classical reissue game earlier is, not a surprise, Mobile Fidelity. They did a range of reissues. I've got a few of them. The ones that I've got actually sound really good. This is a really terrific EMI record that I have the original first pressing of music of Elgar, including his orchestration of Bach, conducted by Sir Adrian Boult with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. It's one of the great Elgar records. But this pressing, it's on 2 records. I'm trying to remember if it's done at 45. I don't think it is, but I could be wrong. I can't remember. I can't see it immediately. But anyway, Mobile Fidelity, they did sometimes futz with the EQ, the equalization, fiddling around with the treble and the bass. It's not a problem for me, at least on this one. Another really terrific couple of records to seek out are the Riccardo Muti recording of The Rite of Spring, Le Sacre du Printemps with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and also his recording of the Mussorgsky Pictures and Exhibition, which also sounds incredible. So Mobile Fidelity did dip their toes into these waters. They did some Decca titles, etc. as well. Now you get into the 90s and you get into one of the most important reissue labels, which is Classic Records, and they did a whole slew of the living stereos, and they were really the first reissue label to really do a huge catalog and start to get really well known. And again, these are beautifully remastered. They go back always with the master tape, which is very important for all of these, and a very pure signal path. But the thing about the Classic Records catalog of living stereos, they put out a whole bunch of records which have not been done subsequently by Analog Productions. This is one of the best. This is one of the best sounding living stereos, I think, and it's a lovely program. Clair de Lune, recorded by the pickup orchestra, the London Prom Symphony Orchestra. It's got it opens with an absolutely gorgeous version of the Massenet Meditation from Thais. It's got Tchaikovsky, Clair de Lune by Debussy, of course, some Bach, Gluck. It's an absolutely lovely record. You could probably still find this for not too much money, but maybe Analog Productions will reissue this at some point. I hope they do. And speaking of Analog Productions, here is one of their titles from their versions of the living stereo. This is a particularly great record. Stokowski is always wonderful with large orchestral music. Analog Productions goes a little bit further than Classic Records in terms of getting everything right. So you have this beautiful heavy cardboard stock, Starton printing. It just feels beautiful in the hand, whereas the Classic Records are not quite so obsessive about all that. Another very important reissue company is Speaker's Corner. They've been doing stuff since the 90s. They've done a lot of the Decca catalog, and nowadays they're branching out into Columbia, which is wonderful. So you're getting Bernstein recordings, etc. Columbia is a label. Their records were never great, very well pressed. So the reissues really are the way to go. Reissues or really good CD remasterings. Here's a really special set that Speaker's Corner put out of 20th century music. This is a series of recordings by the great Antal Dorati, Hungarian conductor. All early 20th century. You've got music from Wozzeck and Lulu by Berg. You've got, look at this beautiful, beautiful artwork. Here you've got some American music, Gunther Schuller, this time with the Minneapolis Symphony. And then this, which is a classic. This is all music from the Second Viennese School, Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, again conducted by Antal Dorati with London Symphony Orchestra. And as you see here, this is an example of one of these where they were originally recorded on 35mm film. They found they could get really good fidelity using 35mm film. And this set comes with a beautiful booklet. You can see here with photos, commentary, etc., etc. It's a lovely set, long out of print. I don't know how much it would cost you to buy this now. It's not going to be a bargain, but well worth getting. Another very important, those were Mercury recordings, I said that. The other American label that did minimalist approach to miking, like the RCA Living Stereo. The other great label I haven't talked about yet is EMI Columbia. Now, amongst audiophiles, these are maybe not so treasured as the other three labels I've talked about, Mercury, RCA, and Decca. But I really like many of the early and later, actually EMIs from the 70s are tremendous. It's a slightly different perspective. It's less immediate because they tended towards a more mid-hall perspective on the orchestra. So you're a little bit more assessed from the orchestra. But there are amazing recordings. Now, one of the reissue labels is Testament. They've put out a whole bunch over the years of these records out on new vinyl. Again, they do a relatively purist analog signal path. This is one of the great recordings of Bruckner, Bruckner 9th in particular. Karl Schuricht, to buy an original of this is going to cost you serious money. This has just been, I believe, redone, so it's in stock again at places like Elusive Disc and Analog Productions. There's also, they've reissued his recording of the 8th, which I have yet to get. These are tremendous old school Bruckner performances. So you've got Testament doing EMI, then you've got slightly more controversially, and they no longer exist, but you can still find their records, HQ Supercuts, and they do the later EMI catalog. This is a great recording of the Symphonie Fantastique with Leonard Bernstein. Again, it's a purist signal path. The problem with these is the actual quality of the vinyl varies very much from release to release. Some of the vinyl is a little bit more loud, poppy, etc. You just have to kind of take your chances, but you can pick these up pretty cheap. And the ones that I've got quite a few of these, and the ones that are quiet, they sound great. So basically, that's talking about reissues of these catalogs where they've gone back to the master tape and they have done it in as purest a way as possible. And you can't improve on the original recording. And basically what happened in classical music recording as the 60s progressed is they started to use more and more microphones so that they could use multi-track tape. They could essentially balance the recording after the fact. And they also got transistors. So these older really from like the late 60s onwards, it's a different kind of beast. And then you get into digital, and digital is a whole other story. In fact, there are many digital recordings and actually digital on vinyl, which can sound really, really good. It depends very much on the engineer and the approach. I mean, for example, I've just recently been getting back into recordings on period instruments by Trevor Pinnock and the English Concert. And many of their recordings are early digital, and they actually sound really good. They don't sound as good as if they'd done it in the old school way, all analog tape, etc. But they still sound really good. So what does this mean for you as the collector? Well, once you get sort of beyond the late 70s and into digital, you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis as to whether you're going to buy the record or whether you just want to get a well remastered CD. I will say that what's happening now in classical music is that a lot of the companies are putting out these big boxes, which are collections of a particular composer or conductor or performer, sometimes remastered. They're all doing it. Deutsche Grammophon, EMI, Decca, etc. I haven't mentioned Deutsche Grammophon. I'll get back to them in a moment. The company that's actually doing this the best is Columbia, CBS, now Sony, and they are putting out these boxes, for example, of Bruno Walter, early mono recordings of Eugene Ormandy, beautifully remastered, sounding better than they ever sounded before, and these I can recommend wholeheartedly. Likewise, RCA, who after the living stereo period, unfortunately they switched their vinyl formulation, and you can go online and read about all of this, but they were recording tremendous musicians, but they were putting out these really not good sounding vinyl, just like CBS. So many of the RCA boxes which have been remastered, those recordings are sounding better than they've ever sounded before. Quick word on Deutsche Grammophon, which was the other great classical label. The thing with Deutsche Grammophon, again from a collector's point of view, collectors go for the early tube mastered pressings, and these are distinguished by having the center yellow label. And the early analog pressings, they have the big, what we call big tulips. You can see on the center label these large tulips around. Ones earlier than this have an even bigger tulip on there. Whereas the later Deutsche Grammophon recordings, when they go to all transistor, got another carry-on record, I just fished this out, Soupy Overtures. And here you'll see that it's a much simpler label on the record, denoting that it's a later issue, later pressing, whatever. And so you can get the same record if it was recorded early 60s. You can get it in an early tulip pressing or a later pressing like that. In terms of Deutsche Grammophon, they're not considered an audiophile label in the same way that Decca, RCA, Mercury are, or even EMI, Columbia. But there are incredible performances. And to be honest, some of these early tulip pressings do sound terrific. I've got the set of, for example, the Bruckner symphonies done by Eugen Joachim. Sounds incredible. Some early carry-on, etc. What I'm going to do down the road is I will focus in on each of these separate labels and go into more detail about, what you're getting in different eras, etc. But to sort of wrap up right now, interestingly, some of the classical record companies have tried to return to a more minimalist approach to recording, not using lots of microphones, multi-mixing, etc. It's very much on a case-by-case basis. You even get a situation like, for example, on Philips, one of the other main labels, classical labels, someone like Valery Gergiev, a Russian conductor, who's done many, he's a big, very hot conductor his recordings still a lot. But he went through a period, and this is when his recordings were coming out on CD, where they specifically hired an engineer who used all tube signal path to record and a much better approach to miking. And some of those recordings, even though they're on CD, they sound tremendous. So really, to sum up, getting the best sounding record, the best sounding version of a particular recording that you want, it's really two factors make something sound good and less good. One is how it's recorded, whether it's recorded with intelligent use of minimal microphones, so that it's not, you're not over egging it. And ideally, if it's used with a very purist signal path, ideally with tubes in the signal path, there's that aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it is the pressing, whether the record is pressed with tubes, without tubes, whatever. And then with so one of the ways to get into classical on a budget is to focus on the reissue labels. And for example, Analog Productions, I mean, these guys, they do everything they can to make it the best possible. And the proprietor, Chad Casson, some years ago, he ended up buying not only mastering studio, but he also bought a record press. So he now presses his own records. And some of the records, like the recently coming out Miles Davis Kind of Blue, they're pressed by hand, individually, each one. And you hear the difference between a really high quality pressing versus just a sort of run-of-the-mill commercial product. So these are things which, if you're into collecting classical records, these are all things to think about. How it was recorded, and then how it's pressed. And I hope I've given you a little bit of an introduction to this. It's a big, complicated area. It's taken me years to learn about all of this, but I hope this sort of orientates you a little bit. And then I will be going into more detail over the coming months, discussing specific labels, specific titles, etc., etc. Anyway, thank you for listening. If you like it, do please give me a like, subscribe. That would be terrific. Just starting out this, wanting to build up an audience. And thank you for your patience, and thank you for your interest. Good day. As a quick addendum to what I had to say earlier, I did just want to mention a couple of books which give you quite an insight into the classical music world. The first of these is this one by Peter Andre, who worked for Decca and then EMI. He supervised recordings working with all the top people. Everyone, Klemperer, Karajan, Maria Callas, I mean, you name it. And this is a great read. It's from a perspective of a classical record executive, full of wonderful stories, lots of insight into the whole classical recording industry. Cannot recommend this highly enough. Peter Andre, Inside the Recording Studio. The other person I want to mention, I don't actually have any of his books with me, is John Culshaw. John Culshaw was the legendary producer at Decca during the late 50s and 60s. He produced many of the greatest classical recordings ever made, Scholti's Wagner Ring Cycle, the many recordings of Benjamin Britten, and Culshaw supervised the next generation of engineers, people like Kenneth Wilkinson, a major figure. And he's written several books, one of which is Ring Resounding, which is about the whole story of making the Scholti Wagner Ring Cycle, one of the, still to this day, I think one of the biggest projects ever done in the record industry. If you go on YouTube, there's also a wonderful behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of the final opera in that cycle, Götterdämmerung. It's full, it's in black and white, but it's just fantastic. And I believe it even has the moment when, at the end of the whole cycle, Brunhilde, the heroine, she summons her horse, which she then climbs onto and then rides it onto Siegfried's funeral pyre, bringing about the end of the world. As a gag, as they, in between sessions of recording this, they actually brought a live horse onto the stage, and it's a great moment. I think it's caught there on film. It's been years since I saw it, but it's a great documentary. He also wrote another couple of books about his sort of autobiography, one of them about his years in the classical music industry, and talks about his philosophy, his experiences. Cannot recommend these books highly enough. So if you want to explore this further, John Calshaw, any of his books, or Peter Andre's book, highly recommended.